having thick armor is not actually the most effective armor in 90% of your games in World of Tanks, but what is the most effective is when you have a perfectly balanced spaced armor vehicle, and today it's time to see why by focusing on two amazing replays that have it all in one of the newest tanks and one of the oldest tanks, the Iron Arnie and the Super Pershing. And the reason why I'm doing this video today is not to showcase about the premium tank meta that is of course facing World of Tanks and the increased armor that some of these premium tanks have over the tech tree vehicles, but it's actually to focus on how you can take advantage of all of these bonuses and of course come away with some ridiculous results, especially if you can find yourself in tanks where you may have to come up against these, and they are often very much useful against players that don't understand the mechanics behind spaced armor. And hopefully you guys will at the end of this be able to deal with spaced mechanics, or at least know some of the key weak points of the two vehicles that we're showcasing. And the first game that we do have is on this vehicle, the M47 Improved, which, I mean, it's an M47 Improved, and you can probably guess why, and that's because this American medium tank that is kind of the main competitor to the Super Pershing, of course the Super Pershing being one of the oldest vehicles, it's kind of the new power creep in my opinion as to which one's better. But this tank features a similar sort of playstyle as the Super Pershing. It does have a little bit better of a cupola in my opinion when you are using the gun depression and you're able to move forward, and that's where this tank slightly differs from what you can usually expect. And because the mobility of this tank is not actually terrible, you can have some really disgusting games, but the spaced armor on this vehicle is what is actually really special about it, because although most people see this tank in the game and it looks like it gets your traditional tank armor, whereby, you know, has these areas on the turret, has this area on the hull armor where you think, oh, of course you're going to be able to deal with this tank. It is just a standard tank. It has the armor that you traditionally expect, but that is completely not the case, and it can actually be way better than even tanks above it in terms of its effectiveness if you don't know what you're doing when you're facing this tank. And of course it does have the cupola, which can be penned on the top, which is what I was talking about, the same with the Super Pershing, but we'll get onto that as we move through this video. But what was special about this replay is just seeing how well this tank can be used when it is used correctly, because so you can see up against a Carnarvon. Now the Carnarvon is a heavy tank at the same tier as this one. This one is technically a medium tank, but we all know how World of Tanks' class distribution really is, and you can see that the Carnarvon is going to struggle because it relies on having the flat, thick armor on its turret to be able to deal with tanks like the M47 Improved. And what happens when that thick armor is actually just not capable of being able to bounce because people are firing heat rounds? And trust me, with all of the balancing features and all of the new tanks getting more and more penetration, vehicles like the Carnarvon just have less and less armor, and it makes it very difficult for them to really be able to compete in today's meta, especially when you look at the spaced armor that this vehicle has. Now unfortunately the T95 is the vehicle that the M47 is seeing first, but having gone for the tracks continuously, and because he's firing spaced heat, it's able to detrack the T95 very effectively. And so you now have this situation where you can basically out trade the T95 because you can rely on your teammates, and you can also rely on tracking it and then hopefully getting around the side of it. Whereas what happens with the M47 Improved in these sorts of matches when the T95 is to come up against it, well, it has to hit the weak points or has to have just unbelievable amounts of penetration for the tier, which the T95 kind of does, but it isn't outrageously good. And you can see he's able to deal with a full health T95, kind of pushing quite aggressively at this point in the game. Granted, a little bit of team support definitely helped with the Shah Future 4, but you can see, I mean, he's only received one hit. He's bounced more than he's actually received in this medium tank that can also do 40 kilometers an hour, so it's not like it's a very slow one. And actually you look at things like the Carnarvon, which have kind of a way worse traverse speed and have a way worse mobility to be able to get forward and deal damage, and then also don't particularly have the highest alpha either, where they can trade with a lot of these vehicles. Because not only does this tank have the spaced armor that's disgusting because of the fact that all of these bits on the turret are actual spaced plates which act as a buffer to stop heat rounds. They basically just absorb heat rounds, and that is what spaced armor is all about. It's trying to block and increase the overall thickness, because the round A has to go through the spaced armor plate and then pen the actual armor behind it, making it effectively better than just having a thick piece of armor. And that was really what is super annoying. And if you correspond that with the fact that, you know, as the armor is usually in a flat plate kind of form, whereby people are able to see it kind of in the orientation like this, where it is flat on the plate, the armor behind it can also be concealed because of the fact that it could be curved, and then you get a weird angle combination whereby it makes it very, very difficult for the same tier tanks to pen you, and also some of the top tier tanks in the game that you may meet in the -2 matchmaker if you are the bottom tier. So that is why these tanks are super powerful, and often you know, if you learn the weak points of them, you can quite easily take them out. And that's why I'm saying that these tanks are usually the best when they come up against players that don't understand the mechanics behind spaced armor and where you should be aiming, because it's very, very crucial that when you come up against tanks like this, that you do know the actual weak points, because they are not obvious like you may see with some of the other vehicles in the game. Because what you see here on the bottom plate here is that you've got a left and right weak point where you can pen quite easily. It's somewhat similar to if you were to take the T110E5, the T110E4, you know, it has the left and right lower glacis which is able to be penned, which is really, really nice, and it essentially guarantees a pen, because it is just an M47 pattern which doesn't have the most armor. It's just that it's got this horrible spaced armor slapped on top of it, slightly weighing it down, meaning that it can't take the speeds that you would expect from some of the actual mediums in the game, but it doesn't sacrifice too much speed, and that's why this thing is just utterly disgusting. Now, you're seeing on the turret there are a few weak points that can be penned, but once again they are just a big blob of spaced armor that covers pretty much everything. So you have to rely on hitting that turret or going underneath the turret on this thing to be able to pen the turret ring. And anyone that comes up against things like the Super Conqueror, if you're looking at things like the FE215B, which is the Bond tank that you can purchase, I wouldn't recommend purchasing it if it's the first Bond tank you're going to buy, but it has the turret ring underneath where you have that turret armor, and that is where you can pen very easily. So it's not the common weak points that you would usually think with a medium, and often the armor indicator says that you can pen certain areas of spaced armor, meaning that most of the newer players and less experienced players will be shooting them, and why it is super, super important that you understand the space mechanics. And that's hopefully what we're giving you within these two replays. But how can you actually use spaced and make it even more effective than it already is? And how can you use these sorts of tanks to make the armor not only bounce, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 rounds in a game where you'd expect it to, but bounce thousands and thousands of damage? And you can see here blocking 3,000 damage in this tank. Now granted, it's not the most amount of blocking damage that you'll see from a heavy tank slash medium in the game overall, but it's a good kind of feature that it is very typical to bounce a ton of rounds. And I mean, even if you look at something like a Conqueror, which has spaced armor on the sides of the tank, as does this a little bit, as you see the side spaced armor plates, which are very useful, but it is where, you know, it just changes a tank from being, you know, okay armor to something that is pretty ridiculous. And what you need to do in these sorts of tanks is you need to hide that lower plate, of course, where the armor and spaced armor disappear and where you need to get hold down. And what happens when a tank that is supposed to be a medium that has spaced armor gets hold down, where you have to hit the cupola if you want to pen the turret, or you have to hit the lower plate if you want to pen the armor, well, your only other weak point is that turret wing, and it isn't the easiest shot, and granted at close ranges it's going to be much easier to hit it, but remember, because it has good accuracy for a kind of heavy medium hybrid that it is, then yeah, it's going to be really annoying for the enemy team to hit at long ranges, and even at short and close ranges, because of the fact that it does have that spaced armor. Heat rounds and often a lot of premium spammers will even struggle against it, so it's not just a pay to kind of beat tank, although, you know, some tank destroyers that have ridiculous penetration. I mean, a Scorpion G may be able to pen the upper plate, but it would have to be a kind of high roll on the penetration to reliably go through this thing. But either way, that is why I think tanks like this can be very devastating when played correctly. And you can see here that when using the gun depression, you can't really get a shot on that turret, but you do expose looking up into this area here, which can be penned quite easily. So you have to be very careful, and unfortunately for the enemy team, they have not been careful whatsoever, and hence why he's been able to pick up over 7,500 damage in the M47 pattern improved, and why even things like the Tiger II, the supposed actual heavy tank at the tier, cannot deal with this vehicle whatsoever. And now he's deciding that he's going to use the wreck of the Vipera to try and bait the Tiger II into firing. And once you do bait them into firing, because the overall kind of aspects of this vehicle allow you to have that decent accuracy, you can usually plow some rounds in, and with heavy tanks not having the best kind of reload in the game, you're able to kind of beat them. Although, you know, you do sacrifice a lot of the damage per minute in the M47 pattern improved, because of the fact that you gain all of these bonuses over the standard tank, having only 1700 basic damage per minute, which is less than probably some of the heavy tanks at the tier. So, you know, it's not particularly the greatest, but either way, if you can, you know, keep yourself in the engagements and you can keep firing like you can do in these spaced armor tanks without actually finding it too difficult, then yeah, I feel like this is a very powerful tank. And we'll see the next tank as well in just a second as the game pulls to a close and we look at the next replay. But let's skip ahead now, because it's just the artillery that needs to be found, and yeah, we'll get a little bit more of a glimpse on a similar sort of tank in the Super Pershing and see what that tank can do. Now he hits the tracks of the Lorraine, which is perfect, kind of backs up, but just waiting for the Lorraine to do a bit of a YOLO, and of course shuts him down as well, picking up the win in that game. So a really amazing replay here in the M47 pattern improved, and hopefully that gave you a good indication to start with as to the power of that spaced armor and the ability to not only have the mobility in all aspects of typical tanks, but having, you know, not having to rely on that thick armor, which is just basically an auto pen for premium rounds. So yeah, let's jump into the next one and I'll see you there. So the next replay that we do have for you today is, as we talked about, in the Super Pershing, and the Super Pershing is a vehicle that has been in the game for such a long time, and at one point was a very mediocre and probably a pretty bad medium tank slash heavy hybrid, as you'd expect, much like the previous tank that we saw with the M47 or the Iron Arnie, whatever variant you want to call it. But essentially what the Super Pershing has is a similar sort of armor model, whereby you have the spaced armor, you also get increased damage per minute on this vehicle over the 47, but in order to do that you do sacrifice 80 damage per shot, which can mean quite a bit, because you have to trade with other heavy tanks at the tier quite a lot. I mean, you have to nearly trade 2 for 1, or at least you have to hit 2 shots to make it kind of even, and obviously if you do pen both of those, you'll probably do more damage than a heavy tank will deal to you overall. But the key thing is that when you do use a tank like this, you kind of have to play it in an element of being quite aggressive. These tanks are not necessarily the best if you kind of stay stationary and you are trying to angle, because when you're staying stationary in a spaced armor vehicle, it becomes a lot easier to pinpoint those weak points. People will often find the weak points easier, but when you're on the move and you're being a bit of a nuisance, being able to hit those weak points becomes a ton harder. And with, you know, bigger heavy tanks, it's not always the case in that regard. So these sorts of things are a little bit different, and that's why I think a lot of people struggle with this thing, is because, you know, if you push forward too aggressively, whereby people don't actually manage to get the frontal armor of this thing towards the opponents, then yeah, I mean, it just sucks, because it is just a super Pershing or a Pershing behind the spaced armor. So I mean, yeah, if they catch any glimpse of the side armor, it's pretty bad. But if you can keep that frontal armor, as you're seeing here, where you kind of force opponents to be sat in front of you or have to trade with you one-on-one in front of them. You can see here the Tiger 131, not particularly the easiest of tanks to really work. I mean, he's trying to side scrape, it's not actually working. He's trying to reverse side scrape, not particularly the best decision, although, you know, maybe it could work, but at the end of the day, yeah, it's just not going to work very well. And when the Super Pershing has to rely upon being able to be a bit of a nuisance, you can essentially make the opponents just feel like, what do I do against this tank? And they can often find themselves feeling quite, how can I say it, they're kind of crapping themselves, to be honest with you, because they're kind of worried about the fact that you can actually deal quite a bit of damage to them quite regularly using the damage per minute, whilst they not necessarily are going to pen you every single time. And it's really frustrating, and as time goes on, and if they bounce quite a few rounds off of you during this period, it only gets worse. You get more frustrated, and that's why I think that you don't always have to look at just the statistics of a vehicle, but you also have to think about how it actually affects the mentality. Granted, it's probably a small percentage of how good the tank can be and how much better it can be, because it probably doesn't have a huge impact, and of course the more experienced players in the game will just know that where to pen you, and they'll just wait for the right situation to engage you, and they won't be trying to face you frontal with your frontal armor. And that's kind of where you can differ with these tanks over some of the others. But the key thing that we have in this replay is a pretty bad loss. I mean, it's looking very bad. Granted, he's done 3,700 damage and pretty much taken out a flank. He is a top tier vehicle, and the spaced armor works even better in this sort of matchup. But you do have to be a little bit wary now, because the enemy tanks are surrounding from all angles, and they're going to be trying to get around you. They're going to be just basically being a flanking maneuver from both behind to the side, and that's why you have to make sure that when you play these tanks, you put them in a kind of corridor style playstyle. I mean, going through the center corridor is often a big misplay when playing in these spaced armor vehicles, because you can get hit in the sides, and as soon as you can get hit in the sides, and if you can get opened up to multiple angles, you'll find that these tanks just absolutely suck. I mean, you will be getting penned very reliably, and yeah, I mean, it's not particularly the greatest, but he shut down the RNG patrol in the game. Both the artillery's gone, and that means that now he really just has to outplay the opponents. You know, you do have to do 3,300 damage, so it's not necessarily an easy task by any means, but if you can catch the opponents out, and considering that the majority of them are lower tier now, it's going to be a much easier task. So what does he do? He backs himself into this little corner. What does that do? Well, because it is a dip, for example, it's a decent defensive position, but it is a kind of last hurrah position whereby, you know, you're not really going to be able to win from here. But when he backs himself down, it means that he hides the cupolas. This tank, much like the M47, has the cupola weak points, as do a lot of the spaced armor tanks. I mean, even some of the tech tree vehicles, things like the TNH and the VZ line, have these kind of spaced armor main turrets, which essentially can bounce quite a few rounds, means that they don't have to rely on that super thick armor and makes them very effective. But if you do manage to get them on a ridgeline and you can get them using the gun depression, this tank does indeed have 10 degrees of gun depression, so very, very good, more than capable of dealing with tanks on ridgelines. It can really open it up and start ripping apart opponents, and actually it's probably one of the tanks that I've always enjoyed playing. I'm not going to say it's broken or like overpowered. This Super Pershing has definitely been in a better place back in the day, but it is by no means feat a terrible tank nowadays, and since its buffs to its actual speed, making it more in line with some of the other kind of faster heavy tanks in the game, it's definitely got a ton better, and it means that you can play that aggressive role where you get into position and you just start mowing your opponents down. And you've seen that in this game. He's managed to not only take out tanks all at once, but also been able to whittle down those hit points there from 3,200 down to 1,600. But there are 3 vehicles still left alive, and one of those is the AMX-12T, which can actually hit him just one time and be able to take him out. So it's a very risky point in the game, and if he manages to come from behind the Super Pershing from their base, it is curtains. And so now in the later stages, when you're having to carry in these spaced armor vehicles, you need to be very, very strategic. And it is I mean, in any tank it's very difficult at this stage in the game, but it's even more difficult in these sorts of tanks. So they're not always the best tanks in the game, and you know, if you are trading off some of the other statistics, the damage per minute and other things about the vehicle to be able to get the spaced armor, you'd hope that the armor works. So it does on these 2 tanks that we've showcased. Hopefully at least you guys know about some of the things that you can do. A lot of players will try to angle in the Super Pershing. It's not a good idea, because what people can do is they can pen the inner drive wheel, which you can see here on the screen, and essentially they'll just go straight through it, avoiding the 2 thick plates on the front of the hull armor, allowing you to easily pen this thing. As well as the fact that, you know, if you angle, you can essentially get hit in the side, and sometimes you'll end up over angling when you didn't mean to, and they can essentially just go through the side of the Pershing's hull, because that's what it is. And of course, if you try angling the turret, they can then get the glimpse of the actual armor of the Pershing to be able to pen it. And yeah, of course you have the cupolas, which are also a big weak point. So there are a few weak points of tanks like this, but you should be very aware of them, because you may need them at some point in the game, and if you do get them, you'll be able to have way better of an impact in the games. Now the T-34-85, which is a very good tank in its own right, did actually get spotted, and the T-28 was following him as well, so you'd be expecting that the T-28 is going to be around this corner, since he's going to be trying to come around and come from behind, or at least follow him around as he made his move. But doesn't seem like the T-28 is making his way this way to kind of retreat back to where he was, but instead is going to come from behind, or at least attempt to. So what do? Well, you want to tackle them head on, you want to know where they are, and if you don't know where tanks are in these, then you're gonna struggle quite a bit. But this is a brilliant example of how not only can you use the tank in its element where it has all of the characteristics that you want in these sorts of engagements, but you can also be very powerful when you do use them correctly. Now, it's not the best idea to actually give the side, because the T-28 may be able to ram you for the damage that you to finish you off, especially if you give the side armor, since it is weaker. But this is where not having a turret absolutely sucks, and maybe you saw the video yesterday where we looked at the turrets and not having one, and how you can still have very good games in those sorts of tanks. But it looks like the T-28 knows that he needs to back himself up, but it is far too little too late, and he shuts him down very easily there, picking up a decent chunk of the damage on the last remaining vehicle in the game. But the AMX-12T on the enemy team hasn't been spotted this entire time, and you'd be expecting that, given the fact that he's trying to out-traverse a T-28, that he'd be able to come up and just finish off the Super Pershing, but it doesn't seem like that's what the enemy AMX wanted to do, and instead he is actually flipped in on his side, and this is just the best feeling you can possibly have in the game. And instead of actually finishing him off straight away, he is of course going for what everybody may be doing and thinking, and that is going for the Fade-In's medal, where he finishes off the ammunition in the vehicle. And I guess we can jump back to see the AMX-12T get finished off in a minute. And of course, by firing off the last couple of rounds in the magazine, he does shut down the AMX-12D and wins the game from a position where you probably would never expect to in the Super Pershing. But the spaced armor really working in today's games, and hopefully it gave you a good indication as to how you can use these sorts of vehicles to come away with fantastic results, and hopefully you learn a thing or two. But of course, if you did, please do subscribe, and I really hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and hopefully you'll join me back in the next video coming soon. Goodbye.